Shio Ganali, Holiday Simmons Dakwadoa, Atlanta Janela, G Zalagi Ale, Black folks from the Mississippi Delta, Uwechi, Mary Dot Henderson Simmons and John Simmons, Ulisi, Mary Jessie Henderson, Udunda, Charlie Henderson, Unesi, Lillian Martin Rogers, Ale Ulesi, Robert Simmons. Ski for having me. Hello, my name is Holiday Simmons. I'm from the Cherokee people and Black folks from the Mississippi Delta. I live in the former Muskogee Creek territories, now known as Atlanta, Georgia, ATL Shorty. Actually, that's Shouty, not Shorty. Um, I'm the child of Mary Dot Henderson Simmons and John Simmons. I'm the grandchild of Mary Jessie Henderson and Charlie Henderson, and Lillian Martin Rogers and Robert Simmons. Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here. I introduce myself in Cherokee as a decolonial act and as a practice in language justice. We believe that when you meet a person, you're not just meeting a singular individual, but a representative of a whole collection of people who are important to acknowledge. We name who we are and whose we are by offering our name, our land, our parents, our grandparents, and their lands as well. We Cherokee people are matrilineal, which is another way of saying mama is the boss. So we always name our mother and maternal sides first. This is another example of Indigenous gender equity. Before I continue, I want to sincerely thank Michael Addy, Miss Dee Dee Chambly, Tracy McDaniel, and Reverend Dr. Aaron Swenson for inviting me on behalf of the LGBT Institute at the Center for Civil and Human Rights. Thank you all so much for the invitation. Thank you for your hard work on organizing this conference. And thank you so much for your patience enduring with my many, many delays. Please do charge it to my head and not to my heart. I want to also thank my fellow board members at the LGBT Institute at the Center for Civil and Human Rights, hey y'all, and to Georgia State University and Columbia Theological Seminary. Appreciations to the leaders on the planning team of this conference, many of whom are familiar and dear acquaintances of mine, including Rabbi Joshua Lesser of Congregation Bet Everim, Reverend Kim Sorrells of the United Church of Christ, Reverend Dr. Letitia Campbell at Candler School of Theology, and Bishop Dennis A. Meredith at Tabernacle Baptist Church. I know each of these folks and I appreciate your work out there, and thank you so much for this invitation and for your work on this conference. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't thank my ancestors, all of the folks that I look up to in this world and in this work. My transcestors, my mentors, my leaders, my clients that I learned from, for your sacrifices and for their endless lessons. I dedicate this speech to the recently departed, but never ever forgotten, our dear Monica Roberts, also known as the trans griot. Monica left us suddenly last week, to the dismay of thousands of community members. She made her home in Houston, Texas, and she was a longtime activist, historian, writer, and speaker. She was a powerful Black trans woman whose work can be found at transgriot.blogspot.com. That's TRANSGRIOT.blogspot.com. Travel safely, sweet ancestor. Moving on to this topic, I have to say that I'm very excited about this topic, trans lives and spiritual care. Usually the term spiritual would be substituted for the word health, and oftentimes, and rarely is the word care used to speak about us or by us. I appreciate the specificity of the term spiritual, and I actually use it within my own practice to describe my work, my services, and my medicine. My practice, Southern Soul Wellness, is a holistic wellness practice for the mental health and spiritual well-being of mind, body, community, and planet Earth. This is a new practice of mine. It's a little older than 3 years old, and it's growing to scale as more and more people prioritize their self-maintenance and their self and community care. While my practice is new, I have been practicing spiritual being. I have been a practicing spiritual being, having a human experience since the age of about 8 or 9, when I first learned that my mother had a miscarriage before I was born. The significance of this news was that I also somehow knew that my parents were only planning on having 2 children. Thus, I surmised that if that child had been carried to term, that I likely would not exist. So I stared at my own eyes in the mirror for nearly an hour upon learning this information. I was trying to imagine myself out of existence. It wasn't a self-deprecating act so much as it was a child's way of trying to make sense of presence, of existence, of matter, and of life. That moment, staring in the mirror as a lanky 5 feet 8 inch 9-year-old who was certain that he was a boy, in spite of the world's female insistence, that moment was the beginning of countless more moments of self-discovery and ancestry healing. By the time I was a young adult, I had turned to the healing and wellness of others as well. Since then, somewhere along the way, I got a master's in social work. I got my first job in Atlanta as a psychiatric social worker. See, it's even hard to say. I was a psychiatric social worker at Grady Memorial Hospital. That was a tough job. And later, I spent 8 years directing national community programs for Black, Indigenous, and LGBT people of color. But then one day I found myself, and it wasn't overnight, certainly it was gradual, but one day I definitely found myself completely burnt out by activism and organizing, community organizing. I found myself jaded by nonprofits and specifically Gay Inc. I found myself curiously at the same, albeit slightly more complex questions that I had started out with that day in the mirror as an 8 or 9-year-old. Questions like, what does it mean to be present? I mean, radically present. What does it mean to be human, like as a species? What separates us from other species? What do we have to learn from other species? Why do we need each other but harm one another? Why do humans repeatedly do things that we know will cause ourselves harm? Why do we dismantle systems of harm publicly but repeat them privately? Does empathy necessarily change behavior? What is the relationship between the oppressed and the oppressor? Between the colonized and the colonizer? Why do humans create binaries and polarities? The questions went on and on and on. Who am I kidding? The questions still go on. But just 6 years ago, on the dawn of exhaustion and confused purpose, I started to co-create some answers to some of these questions. And I started to feel as purposeful as beyond possible. Beyond possible. So I don't think we really need to discuss the importance of the essentialness of trans people having spirituality and spiritual care. So I'd love to share, I'd love to close my window because the dog next door is barking. One moment. Hope that is helpful. Let me repeat, I don't think we need to discuss the importance and the essentialness of trans people having spirituality and spiritual care. We all know the statistics. And I'm a firm believer that we are more than our our difficulties and our traumas and our oppressions. We as a collective human species and we as trans people, I believe that we are resilient, uh, incredible, brilliant, the leaders of our wellness, the masters of our universe, um, and quite frankly, anointed. So I'm not going to spend time on talking about why we need spiritual care, but I would love to talk about what such care can look like holistically, based on my practice and my time with working with so many trans people in a therapeutic and a spiritual manner. And I want to continue this talk actually by how I begin all of my sessions with my clients with a centering exercise. So if you're watching, then you're watching. You're probably watching if you hear this. So per hearing this, please go ahead and I invite you to get comfortable in your chair. This is the time in our talk where we um, to engage more than just our minds and our emotions, but we engage our whole body. And we are going to center in one particular way. Cultures all over the world for time immemorial have been doing centering. Centering is as essential to humans um, as spirituality itself, um, and as higher powers themselves. So the how I'm going to guide us is just one particular way of many ways, and then we're going to have a little conversation. And I just want to remind us that this centering, you can actually keep your eyes open. You can get comfortable, but keep your eyes kind of soft but open. You can close if you don't have sight. Um, or you have limited sight, that's totally fine. All of these practices are for all people, and to that extent, if you need to close your eyes and you have sight and you want to close your eyes, that's fine as well. But we want to encourage you to stay in the space, is not to sort of float away too much, because we are centering as people of purpose. We want to center on purpose. We want to do everything with intentionality. We center because centering helps us come back to ourselves. Centering gives us breath. Centering gives us perspective. Centering reminds us of our gentle power. Centering reminds us of what we care about and what most matters. We don't center to feel better, we center to feel more. So go ahead and get comfortable. You can sit kind of upright, but not quite like you got the solo in the church choir, a little relaxed, but back kind of straight. You can get feel your feet flat on the floor and start wiggling your toes to bring awareness to that connection to the ground, and the ground's connection to this earth and this incredible planet that we get to take care of. And you can take your palms and place them flat on your knees and go ahead and sit back and take a deep breath, inhaling and exhaling. One more deep breath, inhale and exhale. And go ahead and drop into your sensations. In other words, scan your body and notice anything on the sensational level. That is any heat you might feel, any coldness, any temperature changes, any itching, gurgling, digesting, pain, comfort, discomfort. Just take a note, take a scan of your body. Excellent. And go ahead and start noticing what emotions are alive for you in this moment. Take a scan of your body and see what's there on the emotional level. So in other words, maybe the first time you noticed, oh, my eyes feel really tired. So now beyond just tired, what else is what other emotion is there? And we do this scan with loving kindness. We do this scan with forgiveness and gentleness towards ourselves for whatever comes up. There's no bad and there's no judgment. There's no memberships to this party. Everybody is welcome. All the emotions are welcome. Notice any contractions you might have in your body, maybe where you're not breathing or tightening your jaw or tightening your gut, your chest, your butt, your glutes, buttocks. Just notice any tightening and just give them a little breath, help them release. And go ahead now and take the palm of your hand and place it on your stomach a couple of inches below your belly button. So your thumb should be on your belly button and the rest of your hand should be a couple inches below that. And right there is your center. So we're going to stay here. We're going to keep coming back to this place. And from this place, go ahead and just feel the energy there. And take that energy and start extending it in your length, up and down, your vertical dimension. So sending energy down through your legs, down through your hips, and at the same time, sending it up through your torso, up through your chest, and just lengthening, bringing your body up where it's appropriate, stretching it out long where it's appropriate, lengthening. And this dimension of our length is our dimension of dignity. Our self-efficacy, our self-worth, our self-image, our relationship to ourself. Find a nice balance there. And go ahead and start centering in your width, your horizontal dimension, sending energy from that center spot right back where your hand is on your belly button, and sending energy to the outsides of your body, bringing awareness of the distance between your ear to ear, your shoulder to shoulder, your hip to hip, your knee to knee, and across from your toe, smallest toe to across to your other smallest toe. Getting wider as our width is the dimension of our connection. Connection to others, connection to spirit. How wide can you get? Go ahead and take your knees even wider. Go ahead and do the man spread just this moment. Widen your hips, widen your shoulders, widen your gaze, widen your jaw. And now we're going to center in our depth. We're going to take the same spot where our hand is on our couple inches below our belly button. And we're going to send energy behind us. And we're going to bring attention to our back. I sometimes like to roll my shoulders back. Bringing attention from the back of your head down to your Achilles heel. And sending energy beyond yourself, behind you. Our depth is our dimension of our past, of our memory, our survivorship, our intuition, those lessons we forgot. And not just us, but also our ancestors. our history, our herstory, our trans story, our Black story, our indigenous stories, our queer story. And finally, we're going to center in our front on what we care about, on our commitments, and what's ahead of us. Bringing attention to the front part of our bodies, from our foreheads down to our toes. And envisioning things that we care about. Things that matter, what really matters. And we come out of our centering practice with 2 deep breaths. Inhale, taking it from the ground on up to the cosmos. And releasing it back to the earth. One more time, inhale up from the earth. And giving it back with the exhale. Thank you so much for joining me in that practice. Now I'm going to turn our attention to, excuse me, I'm going to turn our attention to sharing my screen as we discuss some of the ways that this holistic trans spirituality care looks like for me, and some practices that I'd love to share with you. So I'm going to share my screen now. Awesome. So I did mention my name in the introduction, and I mentioned my practice is called Southern Soul Wellness. And there we go. So it's so the practice, actually, let me go back for a moment. So my practice is a combination. You'll hear more about it, but it's a one-on-one practice. I also do group work, and I also bring groups of healers together in different cities across the US, excuse me, to create wellness spaces at conferences and gatherings for all kinds of people, social justice organizers, people most impacted by trauma and oppression, like folks who are formerly incarcerated and coming out of detention centers. So that's the practice. I'm specifically going to share with you about somatics, as that is sort of I'm trained as a psychotherapist, but a lot of the practice now is dealing with a healing modality called somatics. And what the centering practice that we just did is a somatics here, centering. So what is somatics? It is, let me move my little window because I can't see. There we go. Somatics. So I mentioned I'm trained as a psychotherapist. So all of the psychotherapy, psychiatry, psychology primarily focus on the psyche, and so the brain functioning, and trauma and healing as it relates to how the brain works and how people think. And so where those medicines speak, those disciplines, their medicine is mostly around changing how you think and changing how your brain functions. And so that's great. However, humans have this whole other rest of our body, this whole neck down, that most of the psychs don't often speak to or address. And actually, that's a gap that I found in my training. Is I was like, what about all this other stuff? So that's where somatics comes in for me. And there's plenty of other healing modalities that bridge that gap as well. This is just one that I love and practice. So the root word of somatics is soma, which is Greek for of the body as perceived from within. So not so much the body as I'm looking at someone from the outside, but if you're taking the body and looking at it from the outside in. So its processes, its functions, and then also, of course, outward behaviors. So it speaks to the body. And it is a combination of movement theory, psychotherapy, and body work. So in sessions, there is a bit of talk therapy involved. And then there's a ton of somatic practices, which are actual movement practices, even on Zoom. And then back before COVID, it also involved body work, which means the client lays on like a massage table, and you do it's a hands-on healing modality that's kind of like massage, but it's kind of like Reiki in the sense where there's energy involved, but there's touch. So it's kind of like massage where there's deep tissue, but it's not just trying to remove pain like massage or loosen up tight muscles. It's also trying to sort of clear energetic channels to make space for whatever the client needs space to be made for. So that's kind of what the practice looks like. And it also integrates that brain and body split that I mentioned, not just in psychotherapy and the psychs, but the brain and body split that is the world, the brain and body split that white supremacy and colonialism has gifted us. The world that says that there is a split between the brain and the body, the world that says in this binary split that we should honor rational thinking and ordered thinking over narrative and intuition, that we should honor the written word versus the spoken word, and things like this that I'm sure most folks are familiar with. So somatics attempts to integrate that both in its healing modality, but also as a world view. Somatics recognizes trauma is oppression and oppression is trauma. A lot of times, social justice activists or community organizers, we think of them working with oppression and oppressive systems and things that happen, bad things that happen out there to us as a group of people. And then we think of our mental health and our clergy and spiritual people as dealing with our personal traumas that happen in our homes or in our families or behind closed doors. And somatics recognizes that they are one and the same to the human body. In other words, even if you have never yourself been targeted or harmed by the police, seeing an image of that enough, especially people who look like you, it will land on your body. So that's we think of police violence as an oppressive thing, is under white supremacy and masculinity, but it also is a traumatic thing, whether we've actually experienced it or not, and vice versa. Survivors of intimate partner violence, that's a personal thing, but of course, it roots to larger, gender oppression and oppression within families and relationships. So it's a kind of a way, the personal is political, essentially. So it's a practice that really practices. And I just want to just tweak that definition a little bit. The jaunt, the departure from traditional Western mental health and somatics related to this is that it's been my experience as someone who has received years of counseling and who has been a therapist for a little bit of time, that um, the oppression and social justice issues, I feel like, aren't addressed enough in mental health settings and with mental health practitioners. And it's kind of like, we'll talk about daddy issues, but not necessarily big brother issues, if you know what I mean. So there you go. Somatics also encourages embodiment through individual and shared practice. So first of all, keyword embodiment. So not just like mentally connecting dots about oppression and trauma through talk therapy, but also these practices that help you embody where is the trauma lodged in your body and what can you do to retrain yourself and reset your soma, as well as work on the neuroplasticity. You can retrain the neuroplasticity out of that's one way to retrain trauma out of your body. So it encourages embodiment, but also not just individual with one practitioner, but also shared practices. So a lot of homework assignments I give involve people making requests and trying things with other people, and having accountability partners. And so the idea again is like, don't just step away from your life into this private office for your mental health and spiritual wellness, but like also make that part of your everyday life in some way. Finally, Somatics attempts to bridge the gap um, between our ideals and our lived practices, which is something I think all of us are always trying to do. Is, you know, we believe in all of these things, and then our actual lived practices are not always right there in sync. There's usually a gap. So somatics attempts to point out, what is it that you care about. Some of the main questions we ask are, what do you care about, and then what are you practicing. Sometimes what you're practicing does not match what you actually care about, because so many things are set up to distract us. Oppression is distracting. Trauma is distracting at the very least. So that's somatics. And I think it's an incredible healing modality for trans people because it's so holistic. It's so brain and body and community and self and all of that. Um, let's talk about centering. So I talked about some of we just did a centering practice. I so encourage everyone to do that. You can do it on your own in your own way. You could do it the way that I get guided us, but it's not something, um, you know how our Christian siblings say, it's better to have God and not need him than need him and not have him. Same with centering. It's better to have a practice of being able to come back to yourself, so that when you are triggered, when you have those moments where you want to pop off on somebody or you're supporting people who have those moments, um, that you're in this practice of, okay, woosah, counting backwards, what have you. And the more you practice it, it's like a muscle, the more it'll be handy when you need it. So just to repeat some of the things I said earlier in the speech, centering helps us come back to ourselves. It helps us give ourselves a breath and perspective. It helps us to respond rather than to react. You know, when we're not centered, we're and then we get triggered, we're responding from what we call our trauma shape. You know, so our fight, our flight, our freeze, our appease, our disassociate, all of those shapings. And then we're just reacting, rather than responding, rather than having intentional thought. Centering reminds us of what matters most. Again, is this a battle I want to take on or not? How do I want to take it on? How do I want to respond? How do I want to enter this? What matters most? And centering also is a practice of radical presencing. Really helps us be like, okay, what am I feeling in this moment? That's why we always start with, what are my sensations? What are my emotions? And then we do those 4 directions, those 4 dimensions. So that's a little bit about centering. All of my sessions, be it one-on-one work or group work, always starts with that same centering practice that I just introduced to you all. I do it differently each time, depending on what spirit is telling me. I do it differently sometimes for men versus women, trans people versus cis people, Black folks versus Indigenous folks. I tweak it a little bit each time, but yeah, that is a practice that you can do yourself. You can do it with other groups. Um, and then specifically that centering in general, somatic centering that we did, I have here this incredible feelings wheel that I love. I'm one step from ordering the poster and having it framed because I use it all the time for myself, with children, also for my nieces and nephews, and also with clients. So it's created by Dr. Gloria Wilcox. It's an excellent way, especially for the smarter you are, typically, the more learned you are, the more degrees you have, and actually the more of a leader you are. So everybody who's behind this conference and so many people who are going to be watching this, um, the more power you have up here, the more it takes to work on all of this, on your emotion space, your heart space. And so the feelings wheel is so helpful because we often know what we think, but it's often really hard to know what we feel. So the practice of naming what we feel is so important. So I love the feelings wheel. It's the second step in our somatic type of centering. So we have our awareness of sensations, awareness of emotions. I said we next do our length, which is our dimension of dignity. We next did our width, which is our dimension of connection, as well as boundary. I didn't talk about boundary much for the sake of time, but as much as we're going out in our width and connecting to others, we also have the creator given right and the importance to come in and create boundaries for ourselves. God bless a good boundary. Woo! Sacred boundaries. Then we have our depth or our past, so we're going back. And while these are in these linear directions, we can think of it as a circle. And this is also an indigenous practice. Like, I don't know if the way I was trained to do this, let me just add the last one. And then we center in our front and our commitments, what's ahead of us, where we're going, where we're headed. And so I was just about to say, I wasn't necessarily trained to think of this as an indigenous practice, but I've indigenized it because in indigenous cultures, we work with the four directions and also four stages of life, four seasons. And so this practice in the four dimensions also feels like more of a circle than the linear directions. Moving on. Resilience practice is a part of this holistic practice that I'm offering. Here, I just have a grid of what's the difference between coping and resilience. We're actually not going to go over that. You can look on your own. What I want to go over is, I'll go over it a little bit through what I'm going to say on the right is resilience there's a lot of, resilience is overused, underused, and misused. Let me just say that. So what I mean by resilience is things we do to help us both survive and aim towards thriving. So if you look on the left, I'm not going to go over all this. And this is not to shame or blame anything. Coping is essential. It helps us make it. Resilience, so coping is more for survival. Resilience is more for thrival. And there's no shame in coping. It's not to shame like, that's a coping skills and that's a resilience. Sometimes they're one and the same, and the only difference is intentionality. But by and large, resilience actually, brings more feeling and brings more connection, whereas coping sort of numbs and escapes. So that's what I mean by survive and thrive. I mentioned there's an element of intentionality, sometimes the same act. So if you mindlessly are drinking a bottle of wine every day, and you're not aware, you're just kind of doing it off habit, you don't know you're doing it. That's very different than, you know what, today is special, or I've had a long day, I'm going to have some wine tonight, and then you end up drinking a whole bottle. That is very like, it's a little muddy. It could be a coping skill, but there's something about the intentionality of, I am going to do this because, that's different than I'm just doing this. I'm not even mindful that I'm doing it. I'm not mindful of how much I'm doing it. There you go. Resilience is also a practice that grounds us, activates us, connects us to other people, connects us to other species, or to higher powers, as I mentioned. And resilience is a diverse set of practice. I have a joke, don't take a laxative if you have a headache. In other words, if you need an ibuprofen, if you have a headache, you need an ibuprofen. You need a laxative for something else. So we, just like our body, our mental and spiritual health has all sorts of needs, and so we want a diverse set of diverse portfolio of resilience strategies and practices. And lastly, I keep mentioning that it's a practice. It is a practice, not a destination. Resilience is not like, oh, that person is resilient. People can be resilient, but we all are resilient. It's just a practice. You can be more resilient by practicing resilience. So we're going to move on. I know I'm getting really short on my time. The Trinity of Trans Wellness is, I have this quote here from this incredible book, Braiding Sweetgrass by Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer, a Anishinaabe indigenous elder who's also a botanist and a professor. I think she might be retired now. She says that ceremonies are to help us remember to remember. So the thing I most want to point out here is that My integrated approach to trans spiritual care is that we need all three of these things: ceremonies, practices, and resilience. Um, and that they can play off of each other, and that they're one is incomplete without the others. So ceremonies, those are religious services, spiritual ceremonies, or cleansings, cultural holidays and rituals. um, they connect us to others, to our ancestors, to our higher power. They underscore and uplift the personal work that we're already doing. They're usually inspirational. So um, my um, oftentimes we think of spirituality as something that we find in faith-based settings, and I totally agree with that. But I'm just here to say that that's only one part of it, and that's the ceremonial part. Those are rituals, and that's so important to connection and for inspiration, and for spirit. That, however, is very different than having practices. Practices are some sort of consistent support from a professional practitioner. Professional doesn't have to be licensed. I'm intentionally not licensed, because I need that separation from the state for different reasons. And mostly because I don't want to have to call the police if one of my clients is in distress. Instead, I rely on a network of other practitioners. We support each other. um, but any kind of professional, uh, consistent support, right? Unpacking personal trauma, so you can get very specific. So while the clergy folks are preaching about a particular passage or scripture or something, and that can connect to your personal work, and that's inspirational, a professional can really dig deeper. How did that connect to your personal work? How does that connect to your personal trauma and healing? How did that scripture or that sermon, or what did you think of when you got the Holy Ghost? Or at that Seder, what does that specifically relate to your work? So then the self-discovery and the healing practices are actual practices. So there are a ton of them. There's self-talk, there's meditation, there's boundary setting, there's creating a wellness plan with a practitioner or a friend. So these are things that you're working on for your own personal stuff, in addition to those ceremonies. And then these are all helpful to have accountability partners. That can be the practitioner that's holding you to that work, or it can be other support people. Finally, resilience. I mentioned what resilience is. I just want to name some categories of resilience because I mentioned that it's often misunderstood. Body movement, types of resilience, type of body movement are working out, yoga, dance. There's plenty more. I'm just naming a few. Hands-on activities, cooking, knitting, home improvement. Introspective activities, reading, writing, games, nature, hiking, bird watching, gardening, culture, social groups and activities, and the arts, creating artistic things or attending artistic things. The list could go on and on. Um, so I can't just go back to that slide. The point is that, uh, oh, great. I was hoping I had one more slide. How it looks in practice. This is a client that's consented to me using her story and her photo. This is a client in prayer. Um, she's Muslim, and she's culturally Christian, because a lot of Black folks are, but she's religiously Muslim. So this is a Christian prayer she's in, and she practices Islam as well. This is her and I in a session. So she's getting that one-on-one unpacking work, maybe riffing off something that she learned, or that she picked up in prayer. And then down here is her resilience strategy. This client is an activist. So here's a picture of her doing her activist work. So yeah, her community work is one of her resilience strategy. It feels great for her to protest. It feels great for her to disrupt the system, and to make the world a better place. So I'm going to go to my final slide is for who the speech is dedicated to. That's Monica Roberts, who recently departed us last week. And I'm going to just conclude my screen sharing here. And and say again, um, if I haven't made it clear at this point, I want to reiterate that trans people are magical, that we are anointed, that it is truly a gift to be able to live one lifetime in multiple genders, that supporting and charting out our happiness and wellness is as crucial as dismantling the oppressive systems and behaviors that harm us. We need to love ourselves and love trans people more than we hate the things that harm us. And we invite you into this practice of loving us. And in the spirit of that Trinity of trans care, we invite clergy members to encourage their congregation to seek therapy and other support, and to develop resilient strategies in addition to and beyond faith-based services. If you're a mental health practitioner, we invite you into the beautiful world of spirituality and encourage you to support your clients in finding a spiritual base and a spiritual home. And if you are a community member or a trans person yourself, I see you, I support you, and I love you. I also encourage you to create a wellness plan, just as you would balance your budget and plan for a large purchase. Invest in your healing, invest in your wholeness. The most accessible decolonial thing we can do is to take a pause and to take a breath. And we deserve it. We deserve the gift of giving ourselves back to ourselves. Thank you.